In this lesson, we're going to continue from where we left off in the last video, where I just showed you the basic concept of options and why we need to take them into account when we're valuing a company. Because if a company has options outstanding, then that means that there's the potential for new shares to be created, assuming that the investors can actually exercise those options, that they can actually use those options to buy shares of the company's stock. So now we're going to go a step beyond that. We're going to go into an example of how you would actually make this calculation in the context of this case study that we're doing for Apple. And I'm going to show you how to get the information from Apple's annual filing, how to input it, and then finally how to set up the formula and make the calculation to determine what the dilution from options is in this case. So the first step here is to go into Apple's 10K filing, and what we need to get are the number of options and then the exercise price for each option tranche. These tranches over here, an option tranche is basically just one group of options, a set of options. Normally in a company's filings, they're grouped together, and they might say that tranche A, there are 10,000 shares, tranche B, there are 20,000 shares, or 2,000 shares, and the exercise price is $10 per share, $20 per share, and normally they're listed like that in the filings. And this is not 100% correct because not every single option will have the same exercise price like we're assuming right here. But it's a close approximation, and most of the time it's good enough. The only time in which we would not do this is if we had exact information from the company saying that they have a certain number of shares, or if they had an exact schedule telling us every single share and every single exercise price, in which case we'd actually go through and calculate it. But most of the time it's fine just to use the filings. So to get this information, let's go to Apple's 10K. Once again, there's a link to it right below this video. The fastest way to find this information on options and exercise prices is to actually do a search for exercise price. And here we go. It's actually the first result I came to in this filing. Now if you're looking yourself, you can also search for stock option activity, which you see right here. But again, probably the fastest way is to look for exercise price. So what we want to pay attention to here is the balance at September 26, 2009, because that's the date that's closest to our valuation date here. So we see that there are 34,375 shares outstanding, and then there are shares available for grant right here. We want to focus on the shares outstanding number. The ones available for grant, this just means how many shares have been authorized. So the company is authorized up to this total number of options, but they've only actually made available this number. So the 34,375 number here is the one that we care about. One question that comes up is, do we want to take a look at the total balance here or just the options that are actually exercisable? Because sometimes companies will issue options and there will be a time limit or a time constraint, and they'll say, well, we have these 100,000 options outstanding, but you can't exercise them for another month or another year or something like that. We could really do either one here, and it varies by bank and by group. In this case, I'm just going to go with the greater number here and go with options outstanding as of September 26, 2009. Again, it doesn't matter which one we use. We just have to be consistent when we look at this and when we use this approach with other companies. So let's go back to our file now. I'm going to enter 34,375 right here, and then 8117 for the exercise price. Now remember the units here, the 34,375, so this is in thousands. So I should really modify this note here at the top and say share and option counts in thousands. But usually you assume that there are both in thousands if the shares are in thousands, so I'll leave that. And so what we now need to do is figure out the dilution from this amount of options, from these 34 million worth of options here. So the way I'm going to do this, let's just think through the formula and how this should work. And let's just tackle the easiest case here first. So the easiest case here is if the exercise price exceeds the share price up here, then we get no dilution. And the reason is obvious. If the exercise price here were, say, $300, well, Apple's share price is currently $192.06. So the option holders cannot even exercise their options, so they cannot possibly create additional shares outstanding here. So that's the easiest case, which is why I wanted to tackle it first. Whenever the exercise price exceeds the share price, you know you're going to get zero dilution from it because the options cannot be exercised. Now, if the exercise price is below the share price, as is the case in this example, our first instinct would be to simply take this 34,375 number and say that that's what the dilution is. And it makes sense because if this is the number of options, and if the investors use these options to buy 34,375 worth of shares, there are going to be 34,375,000 worth of new shares outstanding and out there. So it makes sense intuitively. But the problem here comes back to something we went over in the previous video on our analogy for what actually happens. Remember that when you make a bet like this, there's another side to it. So you may be able to get something for cheaper than it actually is. So I'm just going to say maybe able to get cheap shares, but you still have to pay, and the other party still gets cash. So remember that in this case, even though we're getting these shares for only $81 per share here, rather than the $192 that the current share price is at, even though that's happening, remember that the company here is still getting cash. And what they do with that cash, they could do a number of different things, but the approach that you usually take in a calculation like this, in fact always take for investment banking or private equity or anything else in finance, is that they use the cash to repurchase their shares on the open market. So we're creating 34 million worth of new shares. What they're going to now do is take the cash that we've given them and use that cash to repurchase the shares that we have created that are now outstanding on the market, the new shares over the 900 million or so that have been created previously. So let's think through how much dilution is actually getting created here. We know it's going to be less than the 34 million number. We just need to figure out how much less. So the first part of this equation is figuring out how much cash does this company actually get when we exercise these options. So for that one, this one's pretty simple. It's just the number of options out there times the exercise price. Because the exercise price, remember, is what you're paying the company to get a share. So it's simply the 34 million times the 81.17 exercise price right here. But we're not quite done yet because that has just given us the amount of new cash that the company has. What we need to do next is take this new cash amount and now divide it by the share price of the company. Because remember, we're assuming that the company is now going to use this new cash and use it to repurchase shares of its stock on the open market. So we're going to take our equation here and then divide by the company's share price up there. And so that's what lets us complete our formula. We see that in this case, the total dilution from this 34 million worth of options is around 19 or 20 million. Now, if we look at the exercise price, that makes intuitive sense because what this is saying is that we're giving the company about half of what its share price is currently worth. So the dilution here is also roughly half of the total number of options that were outstanding here in the beginning. And that's something that you should always do when doing math like this, to always check it and make sure that your math is correct on an intuitive level, to make sure that, for example, if the exercise price here were $5, well, we'd expect a lot more dilution. We'd expect it to be almost the entire 34 million number right here. But that is really all you have to do to set up this formula. If the exercise price is greater than the share price, it's 0. Otherwise, you just take the number of options and then you subtract the options times the exercise price. That's how much cash the company is getting. And then you divide by their current share price in the market. And that's what gets you to the dilution. And this is what we call the Treasury stock method. The reason we call it the Treasury stock method, if we look down on the balance sheet under shareholders' equity, we see this Treasury stock line item right in here. This Treasury stock line item refers to any shares the company has repurchased. So Treasury stock means repurchased shares. And what we're doing with our calculation right here is exactly that. We're assuming that the company gets this cash from these options being exercised and then use that cash to repurchase the shares. And so that's why we call this the Treasury stock method. The only complication here is if we had multiple tranches, we would simply write down the number and exercise price and assume dilution for each of those and then just copy this formula down. So I'm just going to sum up what we've done here, total. Now I'm going to fill in diluted shares outstanding. So what we've done in this exercise is we've figured out how much dilution is coming from the options. So I'm going to take basic shares outstanding and then add in the dilution from the options right here. And then we can now use this to calculate our diluted equity value. So I'm going to take diluted shares outstanding, divide by 1,000, and then multiply by our share price right here. So we see our diluted market cap, our diluted equity value is about 4 million more than our basic equity value. This makes intuitive sense. It doesn't strike me as being too odd. If we're greater than, say, 10 or 20% of our equity value, then that may be cause for concern, but something in this range of a few percentage points makes perfect sense, and it's very normal to see dilution in this range. So that's an overview of how we actually use the treasury stock method to calculate dilution from options outstanding. To get further practice with this concept, in the next video we're going to go over a practice exercise that you can complete that will let you get some practice with this formula and getting used to interview questions on this topic and how to put together information on options to answer questions about dilution and to figure out what to say in terms of shares outstanding and the company's new market cap.